So the slide is already up there. Our message today I've entitled, When It Feels Like Nothing Can Change. When it feels like nothing can change. Let's start with a story, a true story. In March 2020, Greg Mundis, the executive director of Assemblies of God World Missions, was diagnosed with COVID-19. His condition quickly worsened. He was hospitalized. He was intubated, and he finally went into a medically induced coma. Doctors gave the family little or no hope. They had nothing more that they could do. His lungs were failing, his body was shutting down, and they didn't expect him to survive. But even as these medical reports declared defeat, prayer warriors around the world rose up in faith, and people from churches across the globe, 80 million in the Assemblies of God, interceded for Greg, believing for a miracle when doctors saw no way forward. After weeks in this coma, something unexplainable happened. Greg woke up. His body, once ravaged by the disease, began to heal. Slowly but surely, he regained strength, defying every expectation that the doctors had. And today, Greg Mundis is alive and well, not because of human solutions, but because of God's power to change what seemed unchangeable. Many of us face situations where it feels like nothing can change. It might not be a medical diagnosis, but it might be that as well. It could be a failing marriage. It could be an addiction that won't let go. It could be a financial crisis, or any situation that just seems impossible to change. We look at the reality in front of us, and like the Jews in Esther's time that we're going to talk about today, we feel trapped. And that's exactly what Esther and her people felt about themselves. A royal decree had sealed their fate. By the king's own law, they were doomed. The Jews would be annihilated and destroyed. And in Persian culture, what the king declared could never be reversed. It was final. But God was not done writing their story. And he asks in Jeremiah 32:27, "Behold, I am the Lord, the God of all flesh. Is anything too hard for me?" What's the answer to that question? Nothing. Nothing is too hard for God. Absolutely nothing. Jesus reminds us in Luke 18:27, what is impossible with man is possible with God. Situations that are humanly impossible are possible with God. And when things look dark in front of us, when fear grips our hearts, God speaks to us in Isaiah 41:10. He says, "Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my right hand." In our story, if you've been following along in the book of Esther, if you haven't, we'll try to catch you up. The Jews were facing certain destruction, but God is going to step in. When it feels like nothing can change in our lives, we need to remember that God is not done writing our story. We might feel at times that things are dark, but there is light at the end of the tunnel. In Esther 8, we see that even when the world says it's too late, God makes a way. So this morning we're going to walk through Esther chapter 8 and see how it worked then and how God still works today. So God moves even when we feel powerless. And you can follow along in the white page. The outline is in your bulletin there. It has the outline and the verses written out for you as well as on the screen. Verse 1. In that day, King Ahasuerus gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her, and the king took off his signet ring which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Just a little bit of backtracking for those that weren't here. Haman was a high official in the Persian Empire, and he got the king to sign a decree that all of the Jewish people in the whole Persian Empire would be killed, murdered, annihilated at a certain day a few months in the future. Well, God had begun to reverse the situation. Haman wanted to get rid of Mordecai by hanging him in a gallows. And in past messages, we've gone through how that situation was reversed, and Haman instead was executed by the king. But the edict for the destruction of the Jews was still in force, and that was the problem. But God began to reverse the situation even before Esther and Mordecai asked the king for a solution. Haman, the enemy, was dead, but the decree, as I said, against the Jews was still in place. By giving Mordecai the ring that Haman had, Mordecai was elevated to the top position underneath the king. Esther, in her position as queen, gave Mordecai all of the enormous assets that Haman had accumulated. And even though Esther and Mordecai had been elevated, their people, the Jews, were still under threat of being destroyed. But God was already working in ways that they couldn't see. God was positioning them for the next step. Verse 3, then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet and wept, and pleaded with him to avert the evil plan of Haman, the Agagite, and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. When the king held out the golden scepter to Esther, Esther rose and stood before the king. Esther, again, this is the second time she approached the king without being summoned. And under Persian law, you risk your life. If the king did not hold out the golden scepter, you would be executed. And so this was the second time she came before the king. She falls down at his feet, weeping and pleading for her people to stop this evil plan of Haman to destroy all the Jews in the Persian Empire. And the king extended the golden scepter the second time, giving Esther the opportunity to present her case before him. Now, Esther was not just concerned about her own welfare. She undoubtedly would have been safe from this destruction. But the lives of God's people was what was on her heart. She stepped out in holy boldness. She trusted God that the king would listen. And her willingness to keep fighting for others is an example to us of persistent faith. We see God moving when it must have felt to Esther that nothing could change. But God moves. God can move. God does move, even when we feel powerless. So let's think about our own lives. We all face situations where we feel powerless to change things. A marriage might be in trouble. A child may have wandered from God. An addiction or habit that seems impossible to break. A calling for which we feel unqualified for. And like Esther, we may feel that we've done all we can do, and yet the problem is still there. It has not yet been resolved. But Esther did not stop with this victory over Haman. Haman had been eliminated, but she pressed forward in faith, pleading with the king for all of her people. Her persistence reminds us that God often moves in stages. Just because one battle has been won doesn't mean that the war is over. Are there prayers that we've given up to heaven and haven't seen the results yet? We must keep on praying. We must keep on believing. Are there steps of faith we've hesitated to take because we feel powerless? The Bible tells us that God's power is perfected in our weakness. It doesn't all depend on us. God is all powerful. Are there steps of faith that we've hesitated to take because we feel powerless? We feel that there's nothing we can do. Are we waiting for circumstances to change before we act? Step forward in faith, just like Esther did. So an action step for this week, let's choose one area in our life that we feel powerless to change and commit to praying persistently about that this week. Because who is the one who can cause change? It's God, even when we can't. Share your request with a trusted friend. Share your request with a small group. I hope you're all in a small group. If you're not, you need to be. People can pray with you and for you, and your life can be transformed. Or with one of our prayer teams on Sunday morning. Or, as John pointed out, text your prayer request into that number, which is in your bulletin as well, that 833 number, and we'll pray for you. God moves even when we feel powerless. God makes a way when the past cannot be erased. Moving on to verse 5. This is Esther speaking, and she said, "If it please the king, and I have found favor in his sight, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all the provinces of the king. For how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming to my people? Or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred?" So Esther asked the king to revoke the previous decree of destruction of the Jewish people. But that was impossible under Persian law. Once issued, a royal decree could not be undone. She was asking for something that seemed beyond possibility, and it was impossible. But God continues to move. Verse 7. Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, "Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows, because he intended to lay hands on the Jews. But you may write as you please with regard to the Jews, in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring. For an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked." So God gave the king a plan, which he presented to Esther. Instead of erasing the old decree, the king gave them authority to write a new decree that would counteract it. And that is a picture of how God works in our lives. He doesn't erase our past, but he redeems it by giving us a new path forward. Verse 9, the king's scribes were summoned, and an edict was written according to all that Mordecai commanded concerning the Jews, to the officials of the provinces, and also to the Jews. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus, and sealed it with the king's signet ring. Then he sent the letters by mounted couriers riding on swift horses. And so this new decree was written in every language and spread across the entire empire with urgency. God was turning the situation around, not by removing the problem of the first decree, but by giving his people the ability to overcome it, as we're going to see shortly. God makes a way even when the past cannot be erased. You know, as we look back on our lives, there are things in life we cannot undo. There's mistakes that we've made. There are sins that we regret. There are words we wish we could take back. There are relationships that have been broken. And like the Jews in Persia, we may look back at that past decree in our lives and feel we are doomed to suffer the consequences forever. It seems that nothing can change. But while Esther couldn't erase that first decree, God provided a new way forward with a second decree. And that is a picture of how God works in our lives. He may not always remove the consequences of past decisions, but he always provides a path forward, a path of redemption. If you've been hurt by someone else's choices, have you asked God to heal? We need to ask God to heal our hearts. We've all been hurt at one time or another. And not let bitterness take root. Are we clinging to past failures and thinking about them over and over instead of embracing the new work that God is trying to do in our lives? This week, let's write down one past mistake or regret that seems to haunt us, that still weighs on us, and then write a new prayer. Surrendering to God and asking him to redeem it to his glory, to give us a way forward. Trust that he is writing a new decree over our lives. God makes a way even when the past cannot be erased. When God moves, fear turns into victory. Verse 11, the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods on one day throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus on the 13th day of the 11th month, which is the month of Adar. So with this new decree, the Jews were no longer victims. They had the right to fight back against their enemies. What was once a decree of death was now an opportunity for victory. This is a picture of what happens in the spiritual realm with us. Satan wants to destroy us, but God gives us the authority to stand against him, to defeat him. Victory was not automatic for the Jews. They had to fight. But now they had the confidence that they were backed with the king's authority. Many Christians wait for God to remove all battles. Wouldn't that be nice? But sometimes he calls us to step forward in faith, knowing that he has already won the victory. Verse 13, a copy of what was written was to be issued as a decree in every province, being publicly displayed to all peoples. And the Jews were to be ready on that day to take vengeance on their enemies. So the couriers rode out hurriedly, urged by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Susa, the citadel. So the decree was spread everywhere. It wasn't just for the Jews in the capital. It went across the entire empire. The good news of their deliverance needed to be known. Their message was urgent. The couriers rode swiftly to get the decree out as fast as possible. I believe this is a picture of how we as believers must urgently spread the gospel to our world, because people around us are still living under the decree of sin and death. The Jews needed to be ready to fight on that day. Even though the decree promised them victory, they still had to prepare for battle. God gives us the promise of victory, and the things that we face, we still need to be ready spiritually to fight the battles that God has for us. Are we living in the victory that God has declared over us? Or are we still listening to and being influenced by the lies of the enemy? Are we prepared spiritually for the battles that God has for us up ahead? And this message is not about we're never going to have any battles. We will have battles. We need to be prepared. We prepare by being regularly in the Word, by being involved in community with other believers that we can pray together and with. So let's make a commitment to start each day this week by declaring a promise of God over our lives. Whether it's a verse on God's protection, a verse about God's power, let's speak it over our lives before we begin the day. Now you notice in the introduction to this message there were 3 verses. Short verses. Short enough to memorize. About God's power, God's protection. I'd encourage you to use those this week and begin to speak them and believe them over your life and pray them. Verse 15, Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a great golden crown, and a robe of fine linen and purple. And the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews, for fear of the Jews had fallen on them. It's an amazing turnaround. Mordecai had gone from sackcloth to royal robes. Just a few months earlier, he was mourning in sackcloth, convinced that all was lost. And now he walks through the same city clothed in honor and authority. This is a picture of God's power turning our mourning into joy. It's a picture of what God can do in our lives. The people were rejoicing before the battle was even fought. Even though the enemy was still out there, they were celebrating the victory early. And that is a powerful example for us, a powerful example of faith. Rejoicing in God's promises before we see them fulfilled. We see non-Jews being drawn to the one true God of Israel. And when God moves powerfully in our lives, it draws others to Him. We're talking about when God moves, fear turns into victory. Fear has a paralyzing effect on people. Like the Jews in Persia, when we hear the threats of the enemy and we feel like defeat is inevitable, like there's nothing can change in our lives, it can paralyze us. We allow fear to dictate our choices, our faith, and even our prayers. But after Mordecai's decree went out, the Jews went from being afraid of their enemies to being respected and victorious. What changed? The circumstances hadn't changed yet. Their enemies were still out there, but they had been given the king's authority to fight back. What fear is keeping us from living in victory today? Fear of failure? Afraid to try something new? Fear of rejection, fear of what others might think. Fear that God won't come through if we pray. Are we living defeated in an area where God has already given us authority? Have we been waiting for fear to leave before we take action? The truth is, obedience is what defeats fear. Obedience is what defeats fear. So let's identify one fear in our lives. We all have a fear. We might call it a worry. Same thing. Identify one fear or worry that's been holding you back, holding us back. And this week, put myself along with it too, because we all struggle with these things. This week, let's take one step of faith in that area where fear is holding us back. Whether it's having a hard conversation with someone that you've been putting off because you're not sure how it's going to turn out. Maybe it's stepping into a new opportunity, but fear is holding you back. Or maybe it's trusting God in uncertainty, but we must act in faith even if fear is still present. And every morning this week, let's thank God in advance for the victories we are believing for, even when we don't see them yet. Even though we can't figure out how it's going to happen. Remember, God can do far greater than what we can do and even what we can imagine. When God moves, fear turns into victory. Let's see here. There we go. I clicked once too much. Sorry. When Greg Mundis was lying in a coma in the ICU with severe COVID complications, the doctors had no hope. But behind the scenes, God was still moving. God was working through the prayers of his people. And now Greg is healthy. He's serving God, praising God. What seemed final was not the end. The doctor's words weren't the final authority. God was. We see the same truth in Esther 8 and the Jews. They were doomed. But God made a new way forward. What looked like a dead end became a doorway to their victory. So let's think about our own lives. Again, are we facing something in our life that seems impossible? Something that we think could never change? A situation where we've started to believe this is just how it is. Nothing can change. Maybe it's a broken relationship. Maybe it's a financial burden. Perhaps it's a health issue, a habitual sin, or an unanswered prayer that you prayed and it seems like nothing is happening. But here's what God wants us to remember. God is never out of options. It's like, whoops, that's beyond what I can take care of. No, God is never out of options. The same God who delivered the Jews from certain destruction is the God who can heal our bodies. He's the God who can restore our marriages. He can provide for our needs. He can break any chains that have held us captive. He can do anything. Nothing is impossible with God. And so today we have a choice. Will we accept the situation as it is in our lives that needs to change? We know it needs to change. But will we accept it, or will we believe that God can still move? Because the truth is that when it feels like nothing can change, God can change everything.